Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Point Blank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday live from East London. Today we're joined by our Art of Mixing instructor Justin Lyndley to take a look at some tricks in shaping your drums. So today we are joined by Justin Lyndley to take a look at shaping drum sounds using saturation, some parallel techniques, the old favourite. And we're going to dive into that in a second, but if you do want to learn more about mixing and mastering and all that good stuff, check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. And remember, we are live, so get your questions in the chat room and we'll get to them throughout the broadcast. Justin, welcome to the Friday Forum Live studios.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, yes.
Excellent.
Yes,
so today is all about drums.
It is, yeah. We're particularly looking at some techniques for adding colour and shaping the sound to particularly electronic drums, which can react quite differently to live drums very often.
Exactly, yeah.
Have quite a different shape to them to start with and have a different kind of weight to them and so on. Yeah. So we're just looking at some ideas, just going through some ideas of what a few possibilities are, to add a bit of colour and change the shape and tone of some things.
Nice one. So we dive straight in. Shall we go ahead?
Sure, yeah. Rather than just looking at the drums in solo, there's this particular track. It's a track from one of our art mixing courses. There's a sample running through it, so I thought I'd leave that running most of the time because it's taking up quite a lot of space in the track, and it gives it quite some context rather than just mixing the drums on their own, which is sometimes bordering on meaningless without them being actually in with something. So we have this sample running here, which runs all the way through the track, and it's quite a big part of the sound. Just before we jump in with the drums, I'm just going to bring in each thing and we'll have a look through them. I just want to take you through a little bit just the sort of process of getting this sample to sit as well before we do anything else. Yeah. We're really looking today as well at using Logic plugins, but also some third-party plugins that are free, rather than having to go out and spend loads of money on things. They're either still free or have been free at various times. So I just want to run you through, we're hearing a quite heavily processed, as you can see from here, sample here. Just want to quickly run through what I've done to that. First one here, I've used this A1 stereo control, which is a free plugin. And it's a widener, so you could use it to widen or mono sounds. The bit that I'm really using it for in this situation is that I'm monoing the bass frequencies of this sample just to make sure they're in the centre and they're not causing me any trouble. I've also then got a tool there that I can change the stereo width as I go along, as and when I want to as the mix progresses. So that's just monoing the low in there. I've then got some EQ in here that is really just thinning down this sound. If I just take it off for a second, you can hear that there was a lot of bottom end, a bit too much fizzy top end, and I've taken out a little bit where there was some various resonances bothering me a little bit in that. Because there is a bass in the track and there's other elements, so I'm just trying to find a point where this sample will not take up all the room in the mix on its own. As you said already, we're looking at a few different ways of kind of adding some saturation and adding a little bit of colour to sounds for various reasons along the way. Obviously, a lot of the time, particularly with drums, we're looking at trying to beef things up, make them kind of bigger, fuller, stronger, punchier, all these kind of terms that we use. This is a plugin that from Shattered Glass Audio that's basically emulating a kind of valve type channel strip or preamp. So it's, again, so a lot of the things here are a little bit subtle. It's just trying to add a little bit of, if that's off and back on again, it's just adding a tiny little bit more presence, a little bit more colour to it, and hopefully making it cut through a little bit more on the track. Some of the things that we're doing mixing a lot of the time are actually relatively subtle. Not so many things are like a massive wow for each additional process, but what you're hoping is that the combination of them does add up to that by the end of it. But so that's just subtly adding a little bit more presence, a little bit of colour, and then I've got a limiter that was also free that's a little bit, I think it reacts a bit like a sort of 1176 type compressor rather than being specifically a limiter. And again, it's just adding a little bit of presence, making it come forward a little bit more. Good. without making it noticeably massively
We'll
louder.
put the URLs for all of these free plugins in the comments at the end of the broadcast, so you guys can download them.
Right. And then I've got a couple of little delays on it that are just giving it a little bit more of a roll, just getting it to kind of carry on a little bit. There's one other processor as well that I might chuck in if we get time.
Yeah.
Just to, it's from a company called Sine Vibes, who they certainly did give this away for a limited time. Maybe you can still find it for free. It's at least certainly very good value. It's very interesting kind of transformer with filters on the way in and out of it. So it'd be very interesting for this sound to add in and potentially mess with it. That's just putting it in. We can use this kind of chaos pad type and potentially just maybe mix in just a bit of that sound, and could certainly progress out that sound.
Yeah, you could
Works in
automate
the
that.
mix,
Yeah, sounds
so.
cool.
So we've got that there if and when we need it to just make a little bit more coloration and change in a sort of filtery type way as we go on. Okay, so we're starting from there, and then I just want to add in the kick and clap and so on as we go along. So let's bring in our kick drum with our sample there. Perfectly nice sounding kick drum, actually. It's,
yeah, it sounds good.
You don't kind of hear it and think, well, that's rubbish. That's a terrible
it doesn't
start.
sound
Let's
like it
choose
needs
another one.
work as such. Yeah.
Not as such, no. Some of what we're doing is kind of setting up things so we've got things that we can continue to adjust as we go through the mix.
Yeah.
So I'm not looking to massively change it. I'm just looking to have a few tools at my disposal so I can kind of sculpt it as we go along and see what happens, you know, by the time we get bass and other things in.
Yeah.
So it's quite often, even with something playing, you're not always hearing exactly what's going to happen. There's a few unpredictable factors in there once you actually get everything in the mix. So my starting point was just to trim a little bit off each end, usual thing, just tidying up the very low. And I'm not always a massive fan of filtering off the top, but there was just a little bit too much fizz in this particular sample. So very simple, very subtle top and bottom cuts on that. And then what I'm wanting is some way of potentially making it sound a little bit harder. That was my next thought about it. It's a very nice kick drum, but maybe that's my only criticism of it. It's a little bit soft potentially. So this is a bit of an old favourite for me, the bit crusher from Logic. Although a bit crusher really is sort of designed to reduce the bit rate and sample rate and make things sound rather crunchy in that sort of sense. I'm not really using it for that purpose here. That would be this kind of sound where it's reducing the bit rate or reducing the sample rate. It's really not what I'm using it for. What I'm looking for here is to use this setting which squares off the wave a little bit really. It's, as the graphic shows you, it more or less takes what would be a sine wave and makes it into a
more of a square wave.
A square wave, so towards that. So I'm just looking for a little bit of that. So somewhere around here, it's adding a little bit of hardness, as you can hear. What very often happens when you add distortion or you saturate a sound is you get some benefits to it. Maybe it adds some harmonics or it adds some other frequencies further up, and sometimes something else gets worse with it. Maybe you lose a bit of bottom end, these kind of things. So basically being able to parallel things is the answer to that, where you're kind of wanting the best of both worlds, where you're getting what you started with plus what you're adding. So any distortion units like this that have a mix control in it makes it super easy, so I don't have to go and make another bus and all of that. So all I'm wanting with this is that I can just basically open up our little triangle here, and I've got my mix control, and I can just add in part of that somewhere around kind of 50% or something. So just add in a little bit of extra hardness there, as you can hear when I add that in. It's just making it kind of a bit, it's going to cut through better.
Anyone who was at Leaf last weekend would remember Dusky showing that exact same trick. So yeah, it's pretty popular to get like a thicker, harder kick.
Yeah, so it's kind of squaring it off a little bit. A recent discovery for me, I don't know if people know Tokyo Dawn Labs, who make...
We know them very well.
Quite a few interesting free plugins.
Yeah, they're really good.
There's a really great compressor that they make, and there's some very interesting things. There's one called Proximity that they make, which is intriguing. And I've only recently got into this this EQ that they give away for free, this slick EQ, which again, I'm not really focusing so much on EQ today, but obviously it's unavoidable. But it has in here we have a few different types of equalizer, which has a saturation element to it. So it does change the colour quite considerably. All I was looking again for with this is to add a little bit more low and a little bit more thump in the middle. And there's various types in here. They've called British, German, Soviet, American, and I'd end up with the German one, and it's adding just a little bit more low end to it and a little bit of thump in the middle there. So I'm getting that frequency. Again, a little bit more hardness that I can add in, and a little bit more low here on the bottom also. And the different types of it do, again, have a different sound to them.
Yeah. And when you're boosting by so much as, is that 5 dB or 6 dB on the low end?
Yeah.
Do you pay attention to the key of the track based on the frequency you decide to boost, or is it just by ear?
I tend to do things by ear. I mean, I know it's quite a very popular idea to actually work everything out fairly scientifically, and that's great if you get on well with that idea. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I sometimes find that when I get too sort of logical with things, that the sort of creativity bit doesn't, in my brain at least, doesn't necessarily engage right.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit more of a fiddling around person rather than calculating it, but nothing wrong with doing that, and there's obviously a lot of people get great results from working it out, and I can see the appeal of knowing where your fundamental is in your kick versus your bass and surgically removing them from each other and so on, but it's not usually what I do. I tend to kind of do it by ear and fiddle about. So again, relatively subtle. Then what very often happens as well when you add any saturation to something, and it's sometimes one of the things that people like about the sound of tape or valve equipment and analog gear, is it actually reduces the transients. That initial kind of spike in something gets kind of rounded off a little bit, which is definitely one of the elements of analog recording that changed massively with everything being digital. Those transients, I think, are really useful and really helpful to get things to cut through in the mix, as much as, the sound of analog is often rounding them off. So in Logic we have our enveloper, which I'm sure you know, which gives me an opportunity to maybe add a little bit of the actual attack back on that, a little bit of the punch back on the front of it, and change the shape of it, as you can see here, by adding, obviously that would be rather a lot, or taking away. But just having a tool that I can, once everything's in the mix, that I can just give it that little bit more front on it. Yeah, it's very useful. You can of course do the same on the end, changing the shape of it. What I found on this kick drum was that if I used it to change how long it appears, and again this is very much, judging that is very much down to having very reliable monitoring how long the bass of something like a kick goes on for. But sometimes needing to tighten it up is useful. What I found with this was that if I did it with the enveloper, it was slightly, you can't hear it so much with it not in solo, but it was it's kind of gone a little bit glitchy on the end there. So rather than using that, I like what it's doing to the front of the sound, but rather than using the enveloper to shorten the end of it, I've used a noise gate, so that I've got a tool there that I can, if the way it sits with the bass needs shortening slightly, then I've got something that I can use to shorten it however much I want, and it seems to be doing it much more cleanly than the enveloper does in this case. Yeah, so if that's our starting point with our kick drum, trying to be a better engineer and not to have these too many red lights on here, but
that helps.
Obviously there is a tendency to get more level as we go along, we're adding things that are adding more weight and more punch and so on, so we can obviously at this stage very easily just trim it all back a little bit. Okay, so I just want to carry on and add in some more elements.
Let's do it.
We have a clap here, which has a little bit of hat on the end of it as well. I'm not too worried about that right now. It's a bit weak. It's a little bit weak sounding. It's okay.
Thin,
a bit thin and a bit weak. So I'm I'm really looking then to try and find some way of adding some weight and body to that. That's my hope here. So although it sounds rather thin and weak, slightly counterintuitively, it also does have a little bit too much bottom end going on. As we can see here, I'm not dwelling on the EQ today, but I'm just trimming off a little bit of the kind of low that I can't really hear anyway, so it's not really helping me. And the way that then hits the distortion, what EQ shape there is in that is going to change how any distortion or saturation that it hits is going to be altered by the curve going into it. If there's too much bottom end, it's going to react weirdly. So just cutting a little bit of that. And then again, just classic Logic distortions to try out. This is the distortion in Logic here. Again, let me just turn it on. One of the things it's doing straight away is removing some top end, isn't it? But if I add that in, obviously it's making it a lot more clunky, isn't it? It's bringing up that hat a bit much. Yeah. The top end's not very nice, so I can use the tone control to just remove a bit of the fizzy top. Obviously it's making it considerably louder, but we can adjust that as we go along. So that's okay. I'm not, liking that enough at the moment. I just want to try one of the other distortions in Logic as well and see what that would give us. In Logic X, they made this one look nicer, and I think they've changed a little bit some of the circuits in it. Again, if we go down here and open up the hidden world, I'm not quite sure why there's so many hidden things that I would quite like to see all the time, often in Logic. One of the great ones down here is that we do, of course, have a mix control, which again is really super helpful. So, and there's different kind of circuit types of distortion. When you're adding distortion to anything, the type of circuit that gets overloaded is going to react in different ways, pull out different harmonics, and have different sounds to it. So again, I can mix in a bit of that without losing everything. I'm slightly favouring the other one for now. Go with the original Logic distortion. But it's certainly worth having a little look through a whole little distortion section in there just to find what reacts well for a particular sound. It's rather unpredictable, to be honest. It's very much trial and error. So again, what's happened is that I've lost a bit of the attack. So I like the body of the sound a little bit more, so again I'm just going to use the enveloper to add in a little bit more hit on the front of it again. And just add a little bit of reverb as well, just a little bit of a plate reverb, just to give it a little bit of space. Okay, so a lot of the time when I'm mixing tracks, I'm not really looking that I find a definitive setting for everything straight away. I'm just finding like, well, I've made it a bit better and it's heading the direction I want it to go. Yeah. So
you come back and revisit it as you add things.
Exactly, yeah. I think there's more to gain from having some momentum and keeping going and just kind of improving and getting towards where you think you want to go. So these are not definitive settings, they're just, I'm just adding in some things. So I've then got a couple of hi-hats here, which are doing slightly different patterns here. Let's hear them in the track. So I've sent them to a bus together because I'm kind of thinking that I want to process them in a similar way. I've panned them a bit apart. It's one of the easy ways of differentiating them, isn't it? I'm not like all the way left and right, but a little bit off centre for each of them, as you can see. One of the things I often find with hi-hats in a mix, particularly sort of electronic ones, is that they can be almost annoying and be a little bit up front and a bit kind of too scratchy, like somebody kind of scratching your ears or something. Yeah. So I'm very often looking to kind of change really that texture quite a lot to kind of sit them in a different way. So I was trying a few little things on here. What I ended up with here was, again, this is a kind of like reamping idea. The idea of reamping often implies putting things through guitar style amps or bass amps or so on. Another speaker cabinet that's been around for many, many years is the Leslie, the cabinet that comes with a Hammond organ.
Yeah.
And it has just a different quality from anything else, where it's obviously has a very kind of woody tone to it, has certain frequencies, and it has this stereo modulation from the spinning speakers in it. And there's a couple of them in Logic. There's one in the modulation section that they've made much nicer as well in the last couple of versions. And then there's one in pedalboard here called Spinbox. And obviously it's going to be quite drastic what it's going to do. Really changing. So it's doing a couple of things. It's giving it a little bit of movement and a little bit of modulation in the way that that then sits in the track. I sort of immediately like a bit more that it's just kind of, obviously it's made them a lot duller, hasn't it? But it's added a lot of body.
But that modulation gives it a groove as well.
Yeah.
It's not static.
Exactly, yeah. So another thing in pedalboard that's really useful, again, I sound like I'm obsessed with this idea of paralleling things, because often you make a gain and then you make a bit of a loss on the other hand.
Yeah.
There's, if you go searching down in the bottom of here, there's this tool, there's a little A/B mixer that you can drop in. And basically then I've got a little parallel mixer that I can add in. So I can add in a little bit of the top of what I had there, so I'm not losing all the high frequencies, but I'm adding in that to whatever degree I want.
And then that almost phases against the original as well and creates a kind of phase effect.
Yeah, a little bit more movement and so on. Yeah. Very often that's really helpful with things like hi-hats, just to give them a little, it's a bit of phase or a bit of flange or something, but something that modulates it a little bit to give it a little bit more movement and interest. Yeah. So they're kind of sitting a little bit more in the mix, which is, happy enough with for now. Again, it might be useful as well to have a little look at how the EQ is after that. I'm not too worried right now, but again, very often it might generate too much low end that's not really helping me. So then after my pedal board, I'm just cutting a little more low again. Seems to be making it slightly clearer. So, yeah. Okay. What else do we have in here? There's also a shaker here. Which again, I quite like the sound of, and it's immediately doing a nice job of just picking up the groove a little bit. Again, it has that aspect of just being a little bit too near to you, doesn't it? A bit too scratchy. Yeah. Obviously, I could just put a little bit of reverb in it and sit it back in the mix. I thought I'd try for something a little bit more drastic on this occasion. So this is quite an old plugin in Logic that's will still pop up if you have an older version of Logic on your system. And I've always been rather a fan of this old Guitar Amp Pro. So if I turn this on, well, there's a couple of things happening. One is obviously it's going to massively change the tone. Guitar amps are more or less like having a speaker system with no tweeters in it, kind of.
Right, yeah.
In that you don't really have
it's
much above.
Natchy.
Yeah, there's not really much going on above kind of 4 or 5K, really. So obviously it's taking a lot of top end off. One of the things I like about this as well is that we've got a little spring reverb in there that I really love the sound of spring reverbs on percussive things, tambourines and shakers and so on. Does a great job of sitting it in the mix. So obviously it sounds pretty drastic, doesn't it? But in terms of how that sits in the track, the reverb gives it a little bit of space, and the adding some colour and so on to the mids is adding some tone there. So there would again be an argument for potentially inventing a parallel. Obviously I'd have to actually make a bus on this occasion, which being a bit lazy, I'd like to go for the shortest route possible on all occasions. Making another bus might bother me. Again, if you don't have that one, there's many different amps in Amp Designer that are again going to have different related sounds to them. Or if you had Native Instruments, maybe you have Guitar Rig or something, then you've got a whole world of different ways of sculpting the sound. But this one's also doing quite a nice job. Changing the microphone position and so on has quite a dramatic effect as well, or the microphone type. Again, best chosen really in the track, to be honest. Slightly more synthetic, but it's alright. It's finding a little place there, isn't it? Torn between those two now. I'll go for the old one just for...
Yeah, just for the spring reverb, I prefer it,
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So far so good with my drums. There are quite a lot of other elements that I could carry on adding in. What I'd like to do fairly soon is put in the bass actually and see what that does for us in terms of causing trouble, particularly to the kick, as can often be the case.
It's the classic question.
Yeah.
Balancing the two.
Exactly, yeah. And I'm a little bit saving. I know that I've got a parallel compressor setup that I'm hoping I can use to just generally bring up the presence really of my drums. So I'm sort of saving that to see how much trouble I'm in when I put my bass in, essentially. So yeah, let's just add in the bass and see what's see what we're going to be getting with that. Surprisingly all right straight off. It's not ruined my life yet, which is good. But
that's a good start. Hasn't ruined my life.
Well, that can very easily happen at this point. You think, I've got a great drum sound and I've got some things going on, I'll stick my bass in.
Rethink everything.
Yeah. In terms of order, actually, I just want to say a little bit about what order I quite often mix things in. Obviously, I think it's the most common thing to build up from the drums and the bass and build it that way, particularly with electronic music.
Yeah.
I very often go the other way around and try and get a lot of the music elements in, and then when I put my drums in, I make better decisions quicker about what I need them to actually do to cut it in that track. And then very often I leave my bass to kind of the end, really. It's quite often one of the last things I put in, just so that I'm working out where it can fit, because obviously in terms of waveforms, it's more continuous and it's potentially very big. And I'm looking at everything else, I've still got it in my mind that I'm trying to make a hole for it and leave some space for it. Once it's in, I can't really hear what's going on in the bottom end of everything else. And I'm not too sure earlier on how it can fit or what elements of it need to feature to cut through with everything else. So I quite often leave the bass till later. But then I do quite often have those moments of, oops, for that reason. So it's sounding pretty good. I'd like to be able to just enhance it a little bit and bring out a little bit more character and so on. Again, I'm jumping around a little bit with various other what have been free plugins along the way. Camel Audio, I think, have just been bought by Apple.
They
so
have,
it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. So this has been around and free for a long time.
Could be in Logic soon, this plugin.
Could well be. But it's always been a bit of a favourite. All I'm looking for is a little bit, again, if you push it quite far, it's going to do some quite relatively drastic things. But I'm just wanting it to add a little bit of the kind of harmonics up there. So it's adding a little bit above, some harmonics above in my bass line, so could you be able to locate it a little bit more. It's possible it will get a little bit thick sounding, but we'll see how we get on. And then I was wondering a little bit what would happen if I managed to add a little bit more on the low again. Again, this is having not worked out scientifically what's going on with the bottom of my kick and my bass. Doing it rather by ear. Again, I'll just solo that for a second so we can hear. This is the bass amp designer in Logic. And you can kind of feel more than anything that it's adding a little bit of kind of sub there. Again, not drastically changing the tone, but generating some low in a way that's different from if I boost the bottom end of an equalizer. So, so if we start with that, I've got EQs at either end of this, so I can EQ it into the distortion or EQ it at the end out of it again, depending on what I end up with. So they're there waiting for possible usage. It seemed a little bit uneven after I'd added all this sub, so I'm then just using, again, this compressor from Tokyo Dawn Labs, which is a very transparent one. I think you've used it in some of the mastering
Yeah, we love this
things
one.
before. Again, it's just to even it out really slightly. And then the almost obligatory side chain one. Even though this bass isn't really on all the same notes as the kick, it still does add a little bit of clarity, just knocking it out of the way. I'm not trying to make it sound very side-chained. I don't want it to be noticeably pumping, but just to add that in. Now I can turn my bass down quite a bit, and I'm getting it's cutting through the mix pretty well now. It's sounding quite big in between there. So yeah, I may well fine-tune the EQ at some point. Yeah, it's sounding a little bit thick, so that's kind of taking out a little bit of the...
That muddy 300 range.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and tidying up very slightly on the low end here, so... Okay. So, sounding pretty good to me for now. One thing that I very often, and again, I'm sure it's been gone over in other tutorials, is that very often for drums, I find adding in some parallel, certainly some compression, maybe an EQ into a compressor. Yeah. Or again, we've talked about kind of adding in parallel distortions effectively already as we go along. There's different ways of doing this. You can see I have a drum bus here with all my drums on it anyway. One possible thing would be that I just make a send from that to a compressor. I know a lot of people do it that way. It's a little bit more trouble, a little bit more faffing about, but I usually would then make individual sends from the different bits of my drum situation so that I can just change the balance and change how much certain things come forward. So so I've just got sends here that are sending to I'm going to send the processed version of my hats and my shaker. That are then sending to a compressor on here. So let's just see what would happen if we add a bit of that in. Just making my drums a little louder. But with the compressor here, I've got the studio FET on here. So it's one of the least subtle ones. It's one that's really kind of gritty sounding, or what it's trying to emulate as a 1176 or something. It's one that, you know, has a lot of presence to it. Can be very fast and so on. So I'm able to change the amount of send to each thing, and then the overall how much of it is in the mix, and then rebalance my faders again. I'm getting a few red lights, which is not too bad. Obviously I can trim everything back at this point anyway. I think that's adding a little bit, and then quite often I try then EQing a little bit into that compressor as well, just to see how that works. Tried a couple of different, again, free plugin world, a little bit with this Luftikas. Just adding a little bit of top and a little bit of mids. Kind of also tried something similar with this.
Phase.
That's gone really phasey, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Didn't do that on my one, so we'll leave that one out.
Yeah.
We'll use the one that's not phasing. Sometimes the plug-in delay compensation is a little bit plug-in delay confusion.
But yeah, it's adding loads, thickness,
adding a little bit more,
end,
a little bit more presence, and I've got again more tools that once more and more things are in the mix, I can add into that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice one. So we've got loads of questions coming in. I'll quickly try and get through them.
Great.
Let me just have a read of what we got. Jason Gibbons asking, would you ever use stereo wideners / enhancers on drums? If so, then how?
To be honest, usually not. in that I would really like certainly all the really powerful bits of my drums to remain really centered. So
Yeah.
quite often I'm using them the other way around with kicks or maybe snares, maybe claps to more or less mono them, or at least mono the low frequency part of it.
And that first plugin we looked at had a mono maker in it, as Brainworks call it, but it
did, yeah. But
safe
obviously,
bass.
yeah. So it's great that somebody's made a free plugin that you can mono the low frequencies, because really that's been a sort of mastering engineer's tool for years that they could use to mono low frequencies, so you could cut things onto vinyl that had straight bass.
Yeah.
So yeah, Brainworks make great plugins, but obviously they're expensive and all the rest of it.
So that's
that
a free version,
somebody's made a free thing that we can use to center the low in it.
Yeah.
In terms of stereo spread and the rest of it, I'm very much into kind of using the full stereo width when possible. But usually you can just do that with panning, in terms of if you have all the elements there separately, you can make something wider with a reverb, or you can just pan the different elements of your drum situation out anyway. Quite often if you then went wider than all the way left and right, you're in trouble anyway, because you're starting to really create some phasey issues for yourself, and you're probably making your situation sound a lot weaker, I would expect. So generally I use them a bit the other way around, to narrow particularly low frequencies, and I'm not really looking to widen my whole drum situation beyond what I could with panning and spatial effects.
Cool.
Yeah.
We've got more coming in. D or Gino, apologies about that, is asking, when you mix drums, do you send them to a bus channel and compress them all at once on a multi, or do you compress individually on separate channels? I guess it's probably on both. Right? Depends on the sound.
What I've got here is they are all going to this bus together, but this bus is just like an overall volume control, really. Yeah. In terms of compressing them all together, I'm really doing that with, so I've got individual processing. In this case, I haven't really used individual compressors as such. I'm using other things to shape the sound of it, a bit of saturation and a bit of the enveloper as a transient designer, effectively. So I'm changing the shape of it with that in a sort of compressor type way.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I tend to find is that if you just then compress the whole bus together, is that again you get this thing where you've kind of, some things are better in that it all sounds glued together, and that's nice. But then you probably also create some trouble for yourself in terms of what's happening then to the transients and the punch and so on in it, which is really the reason to use a parallel compressor, which is I'm then getting the best of both worlds. So I've got all my individual things and they have all their transients there. And then I'm using the compressor to have that glued together, things interacting with each other in the sound, but I haven't just got it all squashed. I've got squashed and not squashed, so I've got the best of both is what I'm hoping for.
Cool.
So the parallel is my group compressor rather than it actually being.
Yeah, I mean that is the
everything.
go-to technique at the minute. It's like everybody's parallel and everything, but it works really well.
Yeah, certainly for drums. I mean,
just watch
anything
out for phase.
Well, I mean that's a software issue rather than being anything wrong with the idea. But anything that you add a parallel compressor to is going to become very present and upfront in the mix. So anything you try it on does sound kind of better. But obviously you can't really have everything sounding completely massive and in your face in your track, or you can try, but you're going to have trouble fitting everything in. So some people use it on a lead vocal to make it very upfront, or a bass, or other elements. Anything that you're wanting to make much stronger by pulling up whatever's in the body of it, whatever's in the underneath there.
And you can learn loads more about that on the Art of Mixing course as well, because we're just running short of time, so I'm trying to get as many questions as we can.
Yeah, great.
Can you ask, Mal's asking, can you ask Justin why you sometimes choose to go with a high-pass filter on an EQ and other times use shelving?
Yes. Well, a high-pass filter, obviously, they're a different shape, aren't they? So, I wonder how I actually make that decision. Certainly things where there's the kind of the low frequency part of it, I'm really wanting to tidy up massively. I think it's a little bit to do with naturalness in the sound as well. Like if you cut with a shelving EQ, it's a little bit less drastic, particularly if you're using a very steep filter. The steeper the filter and the more drastic cuts you do, you end up with less natural sounding, which for electronic music you can get away with many things, but say if you were mixing something that has a bit more of a natural sound to it, I'm wondering, having said that, what it was in the mix that he spotted, well spotted. Might have been something like the shaker or something like that. I guess at the time it just felt a bit drastic to go with a steep filter, and that just cutting a bit of the low with a shelf would be the reason. Yeah, hopefully that's enough of an answer to do with how natural or not it would be.
Yeah.
Whether that's entirely logically shown up in this mix.
Who knows?
Yeah.
John Davis asking any advice on mixing kicks and snares / claps together to prevent clipping.
When they all hit on the same beat.
Especially when you're using an envelope to enhance the attack transient of all of them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it seems a bit counterintuitive when you're trying to get all the transients there and all the punch there. Really, if you're in massive trouble, a limiter is what's going to save you at the end of the day, where you're just putting a brick wall in the way that nothing's going to pass by. One of the reasons that we can use limiters for all the reasons we do, making our overall tracks sound louder, is that our ears are a bit slow and we don't notice for a while that when we start to clip off some of the very fast peaks and transients of something. So you can kind of get away with it up to a point of losing some of the hit, losing some of the transient before we really even notice it or feel it or whatever. So certainly you can take a few dB off a little with a limiter. If it's causing you trouble, that would be a reason to potentially put a limiter on my actual drum bus, just to get rid of that problem. These are some of the things that analog recording kind of dealt with for you. You know, if you're putting things on tape, all the transients round off, and a lot, you know, if it's going through various valve circuits and so on, all those things were less troublesome effectively. You know, potentially we've got everything in its most punchy
cleanest,
digital,
tightest form.
So,
not always a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to needlessly use limiters along the way, but certainly they're a good way out of trouble if you have something like that. Yeah, if a kick and a clap and a snare all hit the same beat together, you can get some very big spikes, which be better to deal with on a drum bus rather than then having trouble making your whole mix louder at the end of the day, if that's what you're choosing to do.
Yeah, exactly. Someone's asked, Pasha's asking, can you show us how to make the Prida snare from Miami to Atlanta? I think you probably just have to sample it just like everybody else does. It's probably your best bet there. We've got time for one more question from Matthew. Bramilo is asking, what steps can you take when creating the track or loop to make the mix down simpler at the end? I guess a lot of rolling off will help you at the end. If you're getting rid of the subs where they're not needed, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of creating the track, like writing and putting it together, I mean, the choice of sounds is everything, isn't it, in terms of how that then affects your mix. I mean, if at the point of mixing you're dealing with something that already sounds great and you're able to just enhance it, it's partly easier and a lot more fun. If at the point of mixing you're having to then try and actually make it fit together, like full stop, then
maybe go back, change the sound originally.
Yeah, well, that would be better if you had, So choosing sounds and then obviously sculpting them along the way, but the choice in the first place is what really is going to make a track sound amazing. I mean, the mixing is enhancing or at worst rescuing. Yeah,
for sure. Cool. So, unfortunately, we are out of time for today's FFL. And remember, if you want to learn all these techniques and loads more with Justin and our other expert instructors, you can come and take a course with us here in London, in LA, or online. Visit pointblanklondon.com for more information. And remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all these great FFLs and loads more tutorials throughout the week. We'll be back next Friday with another FFL, so we'll see you then. Cheers.